Hello, I'm Mrs. Jim. You're welcome to the classroom. In our class today, we'll be learning the EA sound. We'll learn the sound EA makes when we see it in words. So when we see E and A together in a word, it's not pronounced no. EA makes the sound E. Say it, E. Let's sing the EA sound song. E, A says E, E, A says E, E, A says E. Wherever I see E, A, I will always remember that E, A says E. E, A says E, E, A says E, E, A says E. Wherever I see E, A, I will always remember that E, A says E. So now we know that E, A says E. Say it. E, A says E. Let's take some words with EA in it. So our first example is SEA. Let's blend it. S says S and EA says E. S, E, C. Our next example is TEA. T says T and EA says E. T, E, T. Our next example is MEAT. M says and EA says E and T says T, M, E, T, meat. Our next example is SEAT. S says S and EA says E and T says T, S, E, T. Seat. Our next example is READ. R says R and EA says E and D says D. R, E, D. Read. Our next example is TEAM. T says T and EA says E and M says T, E, M, team. Our next example is LEAF. L says L and EA says E and F says F, L, E, F, leaf. And our last example, WEAK. W make the sound W and EA says E and K says K, W, E, K, week. So always remember that EA says E, EA says E, EA says E, EA says E. Wherever I see EA, I would always remember that EA says E. EA says E, EA says E, EA says E. Wherever I see EA, I will always remember that EA says E. So now that you know that EA says E, I will leave you with two homework. You will use it to practice the EA sound. So the first is NEAT and the second is HEAT. Blend your alphabet sound and pronounce these two words. Use this to practice the EA sound and you'll get better at it. See you in the next class.